Assisted migration of climate-endangered plants. Torreya Guardians lead the way. This is video number 37 in the Torreya Guardians video series. I'm Connie Barlow, and today is November 26, 2023. Today is November 20th, 2023. And 2 days ago, Fred Bess of Cleveland, Ohio, drove up to Ann Arbor, Michigan for the Fall Orchid Society show. He grows orchids in his basement. He's an amazing plant person. And so he stopped by here, Ypsilanti. It's a bit east of Ann Arbor. This is where I've been living since retiring with my husband, Michael Dowd, in 2020. And he dropped off these Torreya seeds. I'd say this is the most I think I've ever gotten. And I can be pretty calm about it because instead of trying to find everybody to distribute to before the ground freezes everywhere, I just go and I will be taking the seed coat off here of all the seeds, washing them down really well, and then I will be winter stratifying them in a pit that I'll dig on the sunny slope coming off the cemetery in the regrowth forest. Well drained there. I've never had a fungus problem develop in winter stratification of Tory seeds or pawpaw seeds. That actually yesterday I put 375 pawpaw seeds into that same slope for winter stratification. But then in the late spring or early summer, I'll be digging these up, but by then I'll know where they go to, where I'll be distributing them. And our biggest problem here in Michigan, and in fact throughout the Midwest, is deer. And fortunately, being in a collapsed auto town along the Huron River, Ypsilanti, there's some wonderful reforested slopes there that are coming right through the city, but no deer can get in there. And so when I plant either in those places or I find tree falls. Emerald ash borer killed a lot of our ash trees. They fall down, and they fall on top of, in the floodplain area, not so much in the uplands, but in the floodplain area, the subcanopy is entirely old growth Amur honeysuckle, Lonicera macii. It's from Asia, okay? It's not native. But because when the trees fall onto the honeysuckle, they don't break, they bend, hit the ground, and then start growing and growing some other parts in them such that they're making deer exclosures. And I, as a primate, despite the fact I'm 71, I move a lot slower now, I can crawl my way in there and plant seeds. This is the first year I've been planting only germinated seeds and keeping watch of them. So I'll eventually let you know how many seeds are here that Fred Bess gave me. The big female that this came off of, he's got another female stem and then a cutting grown, so it's not a tree, it's just a shrub that's female too. But the bulk of the seeds come from his 3 seed-grown plants that he planted, when was that, 2007? So it would come from about 2004 or 2005, and that makes them pretty old. And every year, more and more of these Torreya seeds, and by the way, this is Florida Torreya, and these are Ohio seeds. More about that later. Published documents on endangerment causes of Torreya taxifolia in Florida. The tagline for this is, from environmental trigger hypotheses of multiple pathogens to focus on a single fungus, and then back to climate change stress as ultimate cause. And why I say back to climate change stress is, since 1905, botanists have known that Florida Torreya, in its tiny little peak refugium along the east side of the Appalachian River, probably floated down there during the time when here in Michigan, my home state of Michigan, we're covered in ice, okay? Floated down from the Appalachian Mountains, back during the peak glacial times and hung out there when it was cold everywhere else. And by golly, couldn't manage to float back up the rivers to get back up into the mountains. And every other species of Torreya in the world that's alive today, now that means here, California, and about 3 or 4 species over in East Asia, China and Japan. Every other species is a mountain species, okay? So let's not debate this. This is a genus that's been around since the long-necked dinosaurs in the Jurassic. Um, and evidence, fossil evidence of way back to the north, certainly earlier or more recent fossil evidence out west in the state of Washington. But that's because they've got volcanoes out there spewing out ash. And so you can get wonderful leaf deposits to be able to confirm that, yes, this is Torreya. But here in the east, the Appalachian Mountains, we don't have any volcanoes. It's really difficult, especially for mountain species that are not very abundant. And their pollen is not distinguishable from 3 other genera among the conifers. So let's get real here. Ultimately, the question is, it's some kind of an environmental cause. I know that. Back in 1905, the great botanists knew that. And when the diseases first started showing up in the 1930s and then really big time in the 60s, such that, golly, by the 90s, I think, there was really no more wild seed production in Florida. The only places to find seeds were in horticultural plantings, still some in Florida, but today, mountains in North Carolina and then some in central North Carolina, and by golly, since 2017, in Cleveland, Ohio. So I'm going to go through about 50 papers here that talk about the whole progression of thinking from environmental cause and then what was the exact disease, but still thinking it might be an environmental cause triggering that disease to finally be able to break down the defenses of Torreya taxifolia. And then it moved off into thinking that it was maybe a non-native disease and lost focus on that. But now that we're in such a climate change, everything is being moved north. And finally, this summer, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was able to post a regulation that said for the first time, scientists working within the recovery plan of any endangered plant or animal can take a look at whether the climate already has made it impossible to do recovery of that endangered species in its, quote, native or historical range, okay? I've known this for a long time, but it hasn't been authorized. So let's go through here, very tedious, but for those who really need to understand why it is that only citizens have been moving this plant north and why it's doing well in Cleveland. I'm planting it here in Michigan, but it'll take at least 15 years before it can start to produce seeds here. But we have a Torreya Guardian, Fred Bess, who even before Torreya Guardians included him, had planted an orchard, legally obtained seeds and seedlings from horticultural gardens, and he just delivered seeds to me less than a week ago. All right, published documents on endangerment causes of Torreya taxifolia in Florida. I began this excerpts of published papers beginning this summer, right when the regulation was changed and allowed assisted migration legally to happen for endangered species. And I just added another one today. These papers keep coming out, but it's so obvious here. So this is going to be divided into 6 phases. Phase 1 begins in 1967. Observe pathologies and identify disease agents, okay? Again, because they started to notice, even though this had been an abundant subcanopy tree in its tiny historical range in Florida, suddenly it was dying. What's going on? Phase 2 is then search for an environmental cause. And this began in 1995. And this is so important. This is already triggering native diseases as well as non-native diseases here in the eastern USA, but out in the Mountain West, we're talking about native bark beetles wiping out whole mountainsides of conifers because of climate change, okay? So, search for an environmental cause begins in 1995. The focus turns to distinguishing a new species of fusarium fungus that had never been distinguished before anywhere in the world, but here it was distinguished, and it was named Fusarium Torreya. Wow, it sounds like it's only here, right? Wrong. We're going to find out later that that naming implied that there was something terribly wrong with this fungus. Okay, focus on fusarium. Phase 3 begins in 2010. Phase 4, fungal endophytes can be beneficial. Now, this was what was going on within the whole botanical field, especially for agricultural researchers getting money from big ag, trying to find ways to how can we improve our crop production, and especially how can we use less fungicides, less pesticides, all of these kinds of things. And so they were looking for fungal endophytes that can be beneficial. Now, endophyte means within the plant itself, not just on top of it that lands on a spore, but it's right inside, and it's a mutualist. The two of them are working together. Phase 5 begins in 2018. And this is where the idea of the plant microbiome, beneficial inside fungi and bacteria, beneficial to plants that were endophytic, endophytes, here it was discovered that they're also in all healthy seeds. There are microbes in all healthy seeds, including fungi. So it was starting to be called a seed microbiome. And then phase 6 is what I'm advocating should start right now, today, right here, is mutualists become pathogens when stressed by climate change, okay? There's some of that found within the scientific papers, but we pretty much show that here in Torreya Guardians, that so long as the Torreys are being planted in the mountains, of the Appalachians, and certainly this far north, whatever those endophytic fungi are that are in all seeds, as has been found in all seeds, they're almost certainly mutualistic and don't express pathogenically unless the tree itself becomes stressed. I mean, think about it. If you're carried forward through a seed into the next generation, and suddenly, as happened in Florida by the 1960s, the trees stop producing seeds. They come up from their stems, the stems die back with diseases, go back to the roots, they come back again, but they don't last long enough to be able to produce seeds. And so what's the fungi going to do? You can't send your propagules into the future inside a seed to go in next generations. No, you have to resort to what's called horizontal dispersal. And that means you got to make spores somewhere on the stem or leaves of a plant. And in the case of Fusarium Torreya, in the seeds, turns out what they do is they do stem cankers. And that is where a wound opens up and sporulates. And so then water and air carry it away horizontally around rather than vertically through time into the next generation. So 6 phases. I'll start off reading purpose and summary. This is how I explain the purpose and then the summary of each of the 6 phases. All right, purpose. Since 2003, I have been analyzing published papers that offer and/or test hypotheses on why Florida Torreya, a glacial relict, suddenly succumbed to diseases in its tiny native range in the 1950s. Until July 2003, I was unaware that, circa 2016, agricultural research scientists initiated a paradigm shift in how they regard microbial endophytes. That is, fungi and bacteria living within plant tissues, but not causing disease. Okay? Under normal circumstances, living in plant tissues, but not causing disease, and in some cases being very beneficial. Beneficial even just to the extent of saying, hey, this is my territory, you fungus out there, you bacteria out there, you stay away, okay? That's really beneficial, keeping the other ones out. It's my world. Okay, so July 2023 is when I first learned this, that, we all knew back in, when I was, this year is the 50th year of my graduating from college as a zoology major, and even back then, we all knew that the roots had rhizobial bacteria that they were mutualistic with, that took nitrogen out of the pockets of air in there and turned it into a form that the plant could then use and metabolize and bring into its body construction. Okay, this scientific shift in understanding, again, agricultural research scientists really around 2016 just ramped up them discovering about the endophytes that are beneficial throughout the plant, not just the roots. This scientific shift in understanding draws attention to the fact that plants have a microbiome. They call it that now, just like we have a microbiome in our digestive tract. Plants have a microbiome. And that fungal endophytes within plant seeds, it's called the seed microbiome, are a sure sign of mutualism rather than disease. Now, I have to say there, the papers that I was initially finding pretty much said that they were a sure sign of mutualism. But all this is so new that they really can't be sure. And I have seen a couple papers that dispute that. Where they say, well, the fungi could have gotten in by going on the flower, the pistil, the stigma, the female part of a flower, penetrating there, and then as the seeds developed, hanging out, but not damaging the seeds, just getting a ride, okay? So that's another possibility, but it wasn't one that I initially came across in this excitement about a seed microbiome. Okay, microbial mutualists can, however, shift into a pathogenic lifestyle if their host is too environmentally stressed to produce seeds. Now, that is so important. I've got to say this again. Microbial mutualists can, however, shift into a pathogenic lifestyle if their host is too environmentally stressed to produce seeds. More precisely, when the symbionts lose the opportunity to use seeds for their own vertical transmission, of descendants into next generation plants, they resort to the less secure mode of horizontal transmission, air, water dispersing their propagules. Creating oozing cankers on stems or fruiting bodies on leaves are their only outlets for launching asexual propagules into the world. And I just say asexual there simply because what's interesting, for some of these fusarium species, fungal species pertaining to what's looked at for Torreya, they haven't really been able to see sexual reproduction. They just see the asexual propagules. That's like clones coming out. That's the exact same genotype as what's been there to begin with, and then the spores of propagules are sent off. I therefore created this largely chronological list of scientific papers and excerpts to encourage others engaged in helping this endangered tree, that is, professionals in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the 2 lead botanical gardens in Georgia, to modify their policies and methods in accordance with the new paradigm. Okay? They're not going to watch this video. I'm creating this video, not sure why, but I like to have as much evidence as possible that we Torreya Guardians are using science as best as we can find it, maybe even better than the professionals are doing. And we're not just having success here, but if this is understood, maybe I'll be able to get more genotypes than one female tree that Fred Bess has reproducing the biggest volume of seeds in his Cleveland orchard, Cleveland, Ohio. Okay? He delivered me somewhere about 1,200 seeds. Okay? I'd love to have more genetic diversity. That's how you really work in moving things forward. But we're limited because the botanical gardens are afraid that because this Fusarium Torreya that's been discovered is in all seeds, therefore it might spread the pathogen elsewhere to other trees wherever it goes. So last couple years, even botanical gardens, arboretums, and even 2 universities have asked me to provide them with seeds because they can't get them from the 2 botanical gardens in Georgia. I wish I had better, more diverse genetics, but this is the best I can do, and they're willing to accept that. A paradigm shift apparently is necessary in order for the tens of thousands of Torreya seeds produced annually in the 2 ex situ groves in northern Georgia to be offered once again for distribution. It used to be that they were willing to disperse those seeds or distribute those seeds. But once Fusarium Torreya came up, all of that stopped. Results of the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, that I submitted to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2018. I've got a link to that. I'm going to pause for a moment here just to say one good thing about how the Endangered Species Act, there's a lot of good things, but one really good thing about how the Endangered Species Act was written and implemented, is that even one citizen, me, in the case in 2018, can launch a Freedom of Information Act and not have to pay money to have the results come in. Also in 2019, after I got the results of this 2018 and learned that the authorities were thinking about genetic engineering of Florida Torreya, when all we needed to do was move it north, I, as just a lone individual, launched a petition to downlist Torreya from endangered to threatened. And part of that was really just to smoke them out of what are your reasons? What are your reasons for not allowing this to go ahead? So I'd like to say that is a good thing, okay? The Endangered Species Act there did well. All right. So, results of the Freedom of Information Act I submitted to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2018 confirmed that ex situ seeds have been left undocumented and undistributed. Seeds are recalcitrant, so they cannot be stored dry nor frozen. The shutdown in seed distribution apparently owes to the fear of spreading a Fusarium species. Eventually it was called Fusarium Torreya, a Fusarium species that has been documented as cause of lethal stem cankers in the wild population left in Florida. But the same Fusarium has also been documented unsymptomatically in all tissues and seeds in northward plantings. Now, not as far north as we are, okay? In fact, Fred Bess offered to send down to the Atlanta Botanical Garden, here, I'll send you some of my Torrey seeds that are produced here in Ohio, and you tell me if there's Fusarium Torreya in there. But no, they were testing samples of tissues and seeds, probably from the Biltmore. Maybe they went to Harbison House too, but the mountains of North Carolina. And that's significantly north and also in the mountains, so it's much, much cooler. Okay, because they had documented it was causing lethal stem cankers in the wild population left in Florida. Okay. The new paradigm would shift the interpretation of the fusarium from exclusively pathogenic to a mutualistic symbiont when the habitat itself is favorable for seed production. And I've already explained that, just in terms of mutualist endophytes, whether it's in the tissue, but especially in the seeds. And if the plant is so diseased it can't produce seeds anymore, what's the fungus going to do? You got to make cankers, okay? So it switches from being a mutualist to being a pathogen. It's the only way you can get out horizontally when your host is dying. So finally, and again, this is in the purpose section, why I compiled all this, is that with such a paradigm shift, recognizing that Fusarium torreyae found in all seeds is a good thing, not a bad thing, okay? It's a good thing. With such a paradigm shift, the ex situ plantings would be useful for far more than simply preventing extinction and genetic safeguarding. Their massive seed production could once again play a role in working toward full recovery and thus delisting via assisted migration poleward in experimental plantings, pursuant to the new regulation adopted July 2023. Now, there's a lot there, and let me give just a little bit of background why I'm really pushing on this. Until there was a staff change in, what year was that? 2015, 2016, I think, 2015. There was a period of about 6 years where, up till that point, where this Torreya seed production in the ex situ orchard, official wild genetics there, producing seeds, was so abundant that the person in charge was just seeing all these seeds laying on the ground and the squirrels taking them or whatever, and said, hey, nobody's doing anything with these seeds. I'm willing to give you some. And it ramped up to the point where I think the final year we got 6,000 or 7,000 seeds to distribute. And these were wild genetics. Staff change happened. I won't say who it was. Somebody moved up from the Atlanta Botanical Garden up to State Botanical Garden of Georgia, which is in charge of the Blairsville site, where we were getting seeds from. Atlanta was in charge of the Smith Gall Wood site. We were not getting seeds from there. Nobody was giving us seeds. And then the person who came in and took that person's place in the Atlanta Botanical Garden just sort of followed the line, and nobody was willing to send seeds out to Torreya or donate seeds to Torreya Guardians anymore. But the Freedom of Information Act, what it showed was that there was no documentation of what the seed production was in the ex situ sites. There was superb documentation of the early years when those the branchlets cut from the wild plants and rooted started turning into shrubs and started producing male and female cones. There was excellent seed documentation through that time by the person in charge of that part of the recovery. But as soon as the ex situ plantings happened, nothing. No more information. We do even better than that. You can go on the Torreya Guardians website and you can see each year I do some reporting on where we're getting seeds, and certainly from our own propagation, primarily now Cleveland, Ohio. So anyway, there's just a lot of reasons why I keep pushing to try to have the Endangered Species Act be a fully good thing for this plant. I mean, we Torreya Guardians might not have known that it needed help, but once we heard it was listed and then we started learning more on our own, we realized that a glacial relict means that especially in a time of rapid climate change, you got to help it to move poleward. So I'm going to now do a summary of the 6 phases, and then we'll see how much more I decide to add on to keep this video from getting too long. Again, there'll be a link that I'll put right here, right now, and that you can also get to in the caption of this YouTube video. And that'll take you to this web document. All right, summary of the 6 phases again. Phase 1. Observe pathologies and identify disease agents. It began in the 1960s. Why did this once abundant subcanopy species of evergreen conifers suddenly begin to die back to its roots in the small historical range of northern Florida? And while new stems continued to sprout from the root crowns, they would always eventually die back. Thus, seed production virtually ended by the 1960s. What were the proximal causes of the diseases? And again, the word proximal, this means like the immediate. What's the proximal cause of my hair being up like this? Well, I put it up there, okay? What's the ultimate cause of my having put it up? Because it's just too long for me to hang down here while I'm doing this, okay? Ultimate cause, proximal cause, agency of what I did. So what were the proximal causes of the diseases? And was there an underlying ultimate cause that provoked the pathologies? Okay, underlying ultimate cause. Like we see now. What's the cause of all the die-off from bark beetles in Colorado and Montana and even Washington now? Climate change. An environmental cause. That's the ultimate cause. Phase 2. Search for an environmental cause. Environmental stress that provoked disease expression in weakened plants was a reasonable hypothesis for this left-behind glacial relict. And I linked to that so that you could go and see what's a glacial relict. This is not a difficult term to understand, and it's not controversial. In 1995, the first paper delineating a half-dozen possible causes of environmental stress was published. Owing to a paucity of quantitative historical data, especially on temperature changes in the ravine habitats, the researchers could not point to a specific environmental shift as the likely ultimate cause of the multiple diseases injuring the species. Okay, I'm just motivated. I have to break that down a little bit there. Prior to the time that statistical significance became really important in interpreting ecological matters, prior to that time, naturalists were able to go into a setting and see things such that why are we only finding living specimens now down in the ravines? Naturalists, when they see something like that, go, wow, well, this tree is really trying to find the coolest spots. But there was no historical documentation of what the temperatures in those ravines used to be. So the only place you could find that kind of thing that made sense, the closest, was historical documentation of what along the river was. Well, that's not the ravines, okay? And it was thought, well, maybe when the dam was built, it did something to changing the temperature. I'm going to read that last sentence again. Owing to a paucity of quantitative historical data, especially on temperature changes in ravine habitats, the researchers could not point to a specific environmental shift that they could numerically document as the likely ultimate cause of the multiple diseases injuring the species. All right, so phase 1, observe the pathologies and identify disease agents. Phase 2, search for an environmental cause. I mean, we don't need to know exactly what the disease is. If there's an environmental cause here, that we can either correct the problem on site or, as Connie Barlow says, move them north. System migration north. There aren't glaciers here in Michigan anymore. Phase 3, focus on Fusarium species as lethal pathogen. Now, this began in the 2010s. And let me just say, the Search for an Environmental Cause, a 1995 paper, I think it was 8 possibilities of what they called as abiotic causes, or at least most of them was abiotic. And that's something other than a disease. You're looking for what's stimulating these diseases to suddenly attack this tree. That was a really important document at the time. But since nothing else could be done, there was no historical data, what else are you going to do? It was sort of left hanging. Nobody really thought much about anything anymore except let's try to improve the forest conditions here in Florida. And they did try to do that, but it didn't help. So, 2010s, enhanced genetic and morphological tools enabled plant pathologists to parse the Fusarium genus of fungi from fewer than a dozen recognized species worldwide into several hundred species today and growing. Okay. Researchers use these tools to declare a canker-causing type of Fusarium on Torreya stems as a species distinct from fungal isolates that previously had been classified as the globally ranging Fusarium lateritium. Okay, another globally ranging. Before they had the technology to be able to look at tiny little aspects of the detailed morphology and say, oh no, this is different from this one. The name chosen, Fusarium Torreya, along with its history of sudden arisal and deadliness, gave rise to speculations that the disease was exotic. That made sense. You think, oh my gosh, how do we know that Fusarium Torreya is actually native here? How do we know that? I mean, it's the only place it's been found. It's just been discovered. And of course, because of the sudden arisal of all the die-off, that happens here in the East when we've had exotic crossing an ocean coming in from another continent. We've had that happen here. American chestnut, Dutch elm disease. When I was growing up in Detroit in the 1960s, boom, went down all of our beautiful elms. Recently around here, the emerald ash borer, also a non-native, has taken down our ash trees. There's just a lot that we're familiar with in that regard. Okay, so because there was a paucity of quantitative historical data, and nobody could point to an environmental shift that could make it through peer review as the likely ultimate cause, there's a possibility that this Fusarium Torreya might be exotic. Made sense. However, even to this day, that remains unproven. And in fact, no attempt was made by the researchers to ascertain a possibly larger geographic range and additional host species of the newly distinguished Fusarium pathogen. Okay. In 2023, a paper was published that lists Fusarium Torreya as one of the Fusarium isolates on citrus trees near Gainesville, Florida. Okay? Fusarium Torreya there, and Gainesville, Florida is not part of the native range, and citrus trees is not a conifer, okay? Now, there was no distinction made there as to whether it's pathogenic on the citrus or it was just isolated. It's one of them there. But I discovered that by using Google Scholar, and I haven't seen anybody else publish that. It should be published. You don't have to worry about Fusarium Torreya escaping. It's already escaped, and maybe it's been around for a long time, okay? It's just one more. You can't just assume it's exotic and just letting those precious seeds rot on the ground or be taken by squirrels because you're afraid to send them north. All right. Once Fusarium Torreya, and this is part of phase 3, focus on Fusarium species. Once Fusarium Torreya was distinguished from the globally ranging Fusarium lateritium The risk of a possibly exotic pathogen spreading northward supplied new reasons for botanical garden staff in Georgia to remain hostile to assisted migration northward, and thus to actions already underway by citizens collaborating as Torreya Guardians. An additional perceived risk factor put a virtual end to harvesting and distribution of tens of thousands of Torreya seeds produced annually in the 2 ex situ orchards in North Georgia that are safeguarding the wild genetics. I already mentioned that. That new risk factor derived from the discovery that Fusarium torreyae was not only in all tissues of Florida Torreya, but even in the seeds produced by unsymptomatic plants in the ex situ northward groves. Phase 4. Fungal endophytes can be beneficial. Okay, here we're starting the good news part, and by golly, isn't it interesting that I'm the only one speaking of the good news part. The papers that have come out that say, wait, finding Fusarium torreyae in seeds is not necessarily a bad thing. You know, it's a good thing. Nope, they're not spreading that news. Okay, phase 4, fungal endophytes can be beneficial, became a prolific topic in academic journals around 2016, having origins in the previous decade. Coming to the fore were review papers on the importance of fungal and bacterial endophytes found within plant tissues. Previously, all non-plant cells and genes found within plant tissues, other than the roots, again, the rhizobial nitrogen fixers in the roots, were assumed to be pathogenic. You find them in the tissues, you think, they shouldn't be here. You find microbes in their gut, they shouldn't be here. Well, we sure know differently now. Although sometimes not inducing any symptoms of disease. Okay, that's how they explained it. Well, they're not inducing any symptoms of disease. New research, however, overturned these assumptions, and those were long-held assumptions. Plant stems and leaves, not just roots, actually require functioning fungal and bacterial microbes in order to be healthy. In order to be healthy. And to deter pathogens. Just as human health is now known to require the health of our intestinal microbiome, review papers on the importance of fungal and bacterial endophytes acknowledge the plant microbiome as important to all plant species thus far analyzed. While some of the review papers pertaining to the plant microbiome mentioned the Fusarium genus as including species beneficial to the tissues of their hosts, none looked into the question of whether Fusarium torreyae may be playing a beneficial role in its host. If there's any science important to be done anymore and funded by the federal government for this endangered species, it's that. It's that. What kind of a role is Fusarium torreyae playing in those seeds? And as a seed germinates, what they find is that it's not necessarily playing a role within the seeds while the seed is dormant, but once it germinates and suddenly that seed is vulnerable to everything that's out there in the soil, it's got its own increment, its own warriors, basically, charging on out and going, this is my world, stay away. That in itself is beneficial, but they've also found things that it actually helps with noticing the timing of germination and other beneficial seeds to the seed other than just being a warrior for a good cause. Let me read that paragraph again. While some of the review papers pertaining to the plant microbiome mentioned the Fusarium genus as including species beneficial to the tissues of their hosts, none looked into the question of whether Fusarium torreyae may be playing a beneficial role in its hosts. But how could it? How could Fusarium torreyae be beneficial to its host if it unquestionably was associated with stem cankers? Well, I've already spilled the beans on that. But I'll keep reading here. You'll hear. Phase 5, Fusarium Torreya in all seeds confirms core mutualism. That depended on papers beginning around 2018. So you see, really ramping up. 2016, Plant Microbiome, everybody's writing review papers. 2018, now the Seed Microbiome is a distinct place, and for different reasons than elsewhere in the plant, other tissues. Beginning around 2018, these papers focused on the mutualism between plant and microbes found within the seeds of plants. This became known as the seed microbiome. It also became apparent that some microbial mutualists that assisted the plant in seed protection and germination would morph into pathogens if a plant were so stressed that seeds could no longer be produced. I'm going to read that again. This became known as the seed microbiome, and it also became apparent that some microbial mutualists that assisted the plant in seed protection and germination would morph into pathogens if a plant were so stressed that seeds could no longer be produced. Consider, if a fungal or bacterial microbe could no longer launch its offspring securely into the next generation of plants, via vertical transmission within plant seeds, its only alternative would be to launch its propagules randomly via fruiting bodies on leaves or as liquids oozing from stem cankers. Canker disease thus came to be seen as a form of horizontal transmission for fungal and bacterial endophytes that normally provided benefits to the plant in return for a share of photosynthates. Quite simply, cankers form when a microbe determines that its ship is sinking. Phase 6, okay, this is the final. Phase 6. Mutualists become pathogens when stressed by climate change. You don't even need any papers to go, duh, I understand that. Mutualists become pathogens when stressed by climate change is a logical extension of the environmental stress implications of Phase 5, especially for a glacial-relict plant that already had to survive in place during the post-glacial rise in temperatures long before anthropogenic global warming ensued. Crucial, too, is that only in recent years has there been ample evidence in Western states that native insects and pathogens can be triggered by warming and drought to suddenly shift into killing vast acreages of native trees in wild habitat. C. Climate change risks to global forest health, emergence of unexpected events of elevated tree mortality worldwide. Now, I have a little story I'm going to say on that one. Here in the eastern United States, we have been so hit with exotic insects, fungus, and viruses too, I think, that have been brought in from other continents, mostly through the horticultural, but also through the packing shipment trade. Emerald ash borer probably came in shipping planks used as boxes for carrying things, shipping across oceans. We're so used to everything bad for trees being an exotic species that when I was at an event here in Michigan earlier this year, I was at a table talking with someone who's very much concerned with plants and knows quite a bit about plants, but she hasn't traveled the country like I have, where I've seen those slopes of native bark beetles just wiping out the conifer trees, the spruces, not so much the Douglas firs, but really beginning with the spruces, the high altitude ones, that she absolutely maintained that the deaths by bark beetles that she was well aware of in the Rocky Mountains, she maintained that those were exotic, beetles. I'm not sure she knew who I was and what I knew, but I just basically, whatever. But I think the experts are like that here too in the eastern USA. I think they are. I think they're not recognizing. Now that's different for the foresters, especially here in the northern states. They are way ahead of the game. And the Canadians as well, they're way ahead of the game when it comes to native forest trees. They see the native diseases starting to take them out with climate change, okay? They see it. But when it comes to an endangered species and the botanists working on the conservation biologists working on one species at a time, this does not ring through to them. So I'm going to keep reading. Thus, the suddenness of Torreya stem deaths in Florida mid-20th century can no longer be assumed as a strong indicator for an exotic origin of an identified pathogen, such as Fusarium torreyae. Continuing, as yet, there are no papers or even documented communications suggesting that anyone other than myself is applying the new seed microbiome research toward helping Florida Torreya recover. Indeed, the argument for prioritizing Torreya's extinction risk over the small risk of disease propagation is strengthened by two papers published in 2023. They conclude that 1. The strongest case for mutualism is for those microbes routinely found within seeds. And 2, Fusarium is one of the 4 most recognized fungal genera entailing seed microbiomes in general. This latter finding is surprising because traditionally recognized Fusarium species are associated with some of the greatest losses of commercial plant crops, especially in the tropics and subtropics. Let's take that in. Apparently, the Fusarium can't really serve as a pathogen outside of the subtropics. So maybe that's the distinction there, why they were taken down in Florida, but they're fine in North Carolina still, and are going to be really fine in Ohio and maybe Michigan for a long time to come. The bottom line, even with no further research specific to Fusarium torreyae, one can reasonably conclude this fungal endophyte is almost certainly a facultative mutualist that undergoes a life transition into pathogenicity when one or more other causes preclude Torreya taxifolia from engaging in seed production. A good place to start is to read the 2023 paper titled Integrating Seed Microbiome Knowledge into Restoration and Ex Situ Conservation of Native Australian Plants. 2023, Australian Journal of Botany. So what you will see here, right after where I finished the summary of the 6 phases, what do you see there? There's Fred Bess. He's over on the upper right there, and those are his still green seeds, and then once they've ripened, they turn kind of a yellowish, sometimes a bit purple color, versus the plant diseases in Florida. We see none of that on Fred's trees, none of that. So the northward documentations of Torreya Guardians can help in this understanding. All right, I will move on next to quickly going through each of the phases, just scrolling through, and you can get a sense of whether you might want to sample this a little bit more. So here's the published documents on endangerment causes of Torreya taxifolia in Florida. I started this in the summer of 2023, and again, I've still been adding new papers. It's definitely over 50 papers now, here in November of 2023. From environmental trigger hypotheses of multiple pathogens, that was back before the 21st century, to focus on a single fungus, that was around 2010 it began, and now back to climate change stress as ultimate cause, and that's because of, look down to phase 5 here, Fusarium torreyae in all seeds confirms a core mutualism, understanding the seed microbiome. So I'm going to go very quickly through here and then spend a little more time on phase 5 there and just show some of the papers. Now, we've already been through this purpose and summary, and what you've already noticed is that I make it easy to skim. Lots of things in bold black, and the most important stuff in red. And so you'll see the first red, I have a paradigm shift in how they regard microbial endophytes. And then I talk about the seed microbiome in red. So we already did the purpose. We spent a long time on the summary of the 6 phases here. Been through all of these. Now these are all my own words. And then of course northward documentations of Torreya Guardians can help, because we show there's no sign of any of these diseases turning pathogenic or even being here. Maybe they can't even survive here in anything. And so phase 1 begins 1967. Observe pathologies and identify disease agents. There you see the 1967, 1985 Fusarium lateritium, 87. Now here's something to note. Throughout, occasionally, anything that's in a red box with a different kind of type, it's note by Torreya Guardians founder Connie Barlow. And this is where all of the above are excerpts, all right? Actual excerpts. But whenever you see a box, I'm trying to make a point. I'm summarizing some things and putting it in the context of Torreya taxifolia and its questions of what really is causing its demise in Florida. Phase 2 begins in 1995, and this is a search for an environmental cause. And I spend a bit of time on that 1995 paper, The Catastrophic Loss of Torreya taxifolia, Assessing Environmental Induction of Disease Hypotheses. So again, this is where multiple diseases were seen. Maybe there's something gone wrong with the habitat. Maybe something humans have done to it. Maybe something broader, as in climate change. And so here you can see quite a few excerpts I have, and I don't bother to put in any box of notes by me. Another paper in there. Again, this is the environmental and then I've got something in here. So continuing on, we get down to phase 3 begins in 2010. Focus on Fusarium species as lethal pathogens. So this is just going down to 1. I begin with an update of the Florida Torreya Recovery Plan 2010, where they mention the cankers and they mention this research starting into looking at what is this Fusarium making the cankers. Moving on, see a note here. Oh, right there I'm talking about. It became thought of as possibly non-native. A review paper in 2010 on biogeography and phylogeography of Fusarium, a review. Now this isn't anything that I found in any of the Fusarium Torreya papers, but this is where you start to get to see that the search for a specific morphological distinction in the Fusarium attacking Florida Torreya was happening around the world. A lot for agricultural plants. So let's break this Fusarium, these various species complexes down into many more species. And so it was controversial. Not everybody agreed with doing that. But 1 or 2 of the top leaders in this global effort in Asia, and 1 here in America doing that, were on the Fusarium Torreya paper. My gosh, look at all that I put in there. Okay, this is good. 2011 review. 50 years of Fusarium. How could 9 species have ever been enough? And this is where you can understand the controversy. This is not everybody agrees with doing this. Coming down to 2011, a novel Fusarium species causes a canker disease of the critically endangered conifer Torreya taxifolia. Lead author Jason Smith, University of Florida, Gainesville, forest pathologist there. Carrie O'Donnell is one of U.S., but one of the global leaders. And this is where they first are really looking at what's going on with the cankers. But notice how in red here, needs to be the host response to infection, particularly under different stress conditions. Okay, this is being acknowledged in this peer review paper, that different stress conditions will induce pathogenicity. Now, 2012, this is just a master's thesis. I'm going to move by this quickly because it's not peer reviewed. But then we have more things in here. Fusarium root and stem diseases. Golly, there's just a lot of stuff going on here. You can look through this more if you want. 2013 is when this fusarium that had already been isolated from the Torreya taxifolia is given a name. It's given a name, Fusarium Torreya. And as I already said, if you name it after the tree it's found in it, it's never been named anywhere else. You can induce a lot of concern that it might be an exotic. All right, and I have a big note there. One thing I might mention, since it's in red caps that I wrote, it should be a priority to immediately identify the fusarium attacking California Torreya, and then ecologically assess whether upslope or northern populations show less or no damage from that pathogen. Okay, it had been noted there, but it certainly isn't wiping out the trees in their native range up in the mountains, always in the mountains. All right, continuing down through here. Here we can see more fusarium species being named over in China. Big effort doing that there. Okay, continuing on down. All right, we're just gonna go through this. You can see all the fusarium stuff in here. Oh yeah, audio podcast interview of a botanical garden staff person. This is in 2019, so this stuff is already known. In November 2019, an audio interview with the primary institutional implementer of the Florida Torreya Official Recovery Plan, Jennifer Cheska, State Botanical Garden of Georgia, indicated that the fear of native conifer contamination in northward plantings, including official ex situ plantings in North Georgia, had ramped up to a level that, quote, if we do see a problem, we would remove and burn that material. That includes even this ex situ genetic safeguarding. That's why this is so important to understand that it's not just one-sided. Just when you find a fungus doesn't mean it's a pathogen. Okay. Oh, this is important. Detection method for Fusarium Torreya, the canker pathogen of the critically endangered Florida Torreya taxifolia. Tyler Dredden, he got his PhD with Jason Smith, who was the one at University of Florida Gainesville, who was lead author of identifying a specific fusarium on the Torreya cankers. Tyler now works with the USDA, and he's done some really important stuff with seeing where Phytophthora basically drops out of being a pathogen as you move north. It just can't survive north. So he's very well aware of stress causing fungus to go pathogenic. I just want to get down to the... Is there anything in here? I think, yeah, the 2020 update of the Florida Torreya Recovery Plan really downplayed the shock and the horror and the big concern about Fusarium Torreya. It's looking into it, but it's not making a big deal of it. All right, moving continually down. Oh, here's the citrus study, 2023, yeah. All right, this is the one where they found Fusarium Torreya, 18 Fusarium isolates in a particular citrus grove southeast of Gainesville. And again, this is outside the native range, so it's certainly already here. Oh, why did I put this in? Oh yeah, this just shows there's another genus of fungus, Fomidoporia, that's been subject to the same kind of species, make it many, many more species. And see there how it's been found on Torreya Guardians, even though that's not where initially it was found. And you see it's a native pathogen attacking Cryptomeria, Cunninghamia, and even some angiosperms there too. So this is just give a little context for not getting too wigged out by Fusarium torreyae. All right, phase 4 begins in 2016. I mean, there are a lot of predecessors, but this is boom. This is where the review papers really start to ramp up. Fungal endophytes can be beneficial. And you'll see I have a lot of red. I do a lot of things in here. I'm just going to move through this really quickly. You can see, you can get a lot more information here. Yourself, there's a lot of agricultural crops that are being looked at for this. Oh, yeah, let me just go through here. Oh, okay. All right. Oh, and so here's, these are actual quotes from here. This one I've got not only in red, but red caps. This is a direct quote. Endophytic bacteria and fungi that are associated with the colonization of plant tissues are transmitted horizontally, plant or soil to plant, vertically, parent plant to seed, or in a mixed way. Most fungal endophytes are vertically transmitted through the seed. Okay, and then I have a note here. All right, this is the part here. These papers, it just nails it. Phase 5 begins in 2018. Again, there's a few other earlier papers, but this is just looking at the seed microbiome, and that confirms it as a core mutualism, not just as a way of carrying a pathogen into the future. All right, what is there in seeds? Vertically transmitted endophytic resources for sustainable improvement in plant growth, 2018. Now here's a review paper, 2019. The Seed Microbiome, Origins, Interactions, and Impacts. Oh yeah, Eric Nelson, wow. Yeah, this one gets a lot of references in the later Seed Microbiome papers. Okay. 2020, Extending Plant Defense Theory to Seeds. 2021, Seed-transmitted bacteria and fungi dominate juvenile plant microbiomes. 2021, Experimental Evidence of Microbial Inheritance in Plants and Transmission Routes from Seed to Phyllosphere and Root. Actually, this one gets quite a bit of play too. And this is a great picture of seeing the different ways in which the endophytes can actually enter the seed, including through the flower as a possibility. 2023, Insights into the Seed Microbiome and its Ecological Significance in Plant Life. And you'll notice there's a lot of these people here who are in the Middle East or Asia. You'll see them coming up here. And India. Oh, here, look at in the red. Fungi as a class, Domycetes, predominate the fungal seed microbiome, and the most abundant genera are blah, 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 and Fusarium. Okay, that's in red. Fusarium is among the endophytes. The seed microbiome. Okay. Laboratory experiments do not capture the complexity of seed microbiome plant interaction that exists in natural settings. Thank you for saying that. All right, well, That's it. Seed 3B, not quite as tall, but it's still got new stuff coming out of the top here. Yeah. May the forest and a bit of sunlight be with you, but not the rodents. This has been video number 37 in the Torreya Guardians video series. You can find more videos in this series by going to the Torreya Guardians website. That's torreyaguardians.org.